let's go ahead and now talk about an area that is really booming from a demand perspective. Now, what's really nice about cloud computing opportunities in the government and military is that not every job will require clearance or will require, for example, FedRAMP knowledge. And I think it's important to talk about sort of some of the opportunities I'm seeing. But before we get into that, let me get some water. Okay, so before we get into that, as Shane had previously stated, military background, I've been in IT for over 25 years. Everything from data storage to cleared and uncleared, basically implementations, sales for that matter. So I lived in DC. I worked everywhere from the Pentagon to Fort Belvoir, over to the IRS and DHS. So my background goes sort of far and wide in that area. Now, the reason that we want to talk about FedRAMP is right now there seems to be a pretty acute shortage of cloud professionals in this area. And a lot of people aren't aware of that. And you don't need to be in DC for a lot of these roles. It could be remote, especially if you're like into pre-sales or professional services like design or implementation. So what I'd like to do is talk about what FedRAMP is and why it's important. And then let's proceed and talk about what exactly are the skills that you'd want to know to get into government and military contracting. And there's several routes for that. Now, I'll then get into, again, some of the more detailed areas where, you know, whether you're like a cloud architect, a cloud developer, or even a systems integrator, you can really expand opportunities. And lastly, I'll talk about some resources. Now, did you know that the US government is the single largest buyer of goods and services in the world? And federal agencies are reliable customers. So what that means is chances are, whether you're a consultant or an employee, you're not going to have a lot of problems generally getting paid, which is not exactly the case in the commercial sector always. So it's really good to have some kind of a role or a side opportunity in the world of government contracting because the customers are usually stable. Now, according to Forbes, what's interesting is that they're expecting the growth just in cloud to go pretty much past 141 billion in 2019. Now, I didn't have the updated numbers for 2021, but that's still a big jump, just as you could see in less than 4 years. It pretty much doubled. And now I know that there's some reports coming out in the next few months. I would expect to see the growth to be at least the same, if not more. So the demand for cloud professionals will still be there. Now, Microsoft was recently awarded by the Pentagon a $10 billion contract for cloud computing. Now, for those folks not familiar with government contracting, a lot of the vehicles, a lot of the awards are basically going to be basically like an agency-wide or a multi-agency award. So that means either it's only for like a specific agency or could be multiple agencies. Depends on who is putting out the initiative and, you know, again, the goal of, you know, sort of meeting specific requirements, maybe between agencies, whatever that could be. So for example, some awards are going to be, for example, in this case, Department of Defense wide, meaning like the Army, the Navy, and Army all included. Some awards are only just going to be for the Army, some will be just for the Navy, And then some, like for example, FedRAMP-based services could be for any agency that is going to participate. So what is this FedRAMP? This is actually a term that even a lot of folks in the federal government still don't totally understand. And there's a lot of confusion around it for good reason. And here's why. The government has a tendency to use a lot of jargon. And basically, when it comes to jargon, it gets all jumbled up, right? We forget what this acronym means and what that acronym means and how they come together. So FedRAMP FedRAMP is basically called the Federal Risk and Authorization Management Program. This is a government-wide program. So government-wide means it could be military, civilian sector as well, can participate in this program where there's a standardized approach to security assessments, authorization, and continuous monitoring of cloud products, that is. Now, why is this important? Because before FedRAMP, we generally had every agency, whether they were in the DoD or not, doing their own little thing. Some organizations knew how to manage security. Some organizations really didn't manage security. So that brought up the challenge of having some kind of standardization in the government so that when it came to managing risk, and FedRAMP really is more of a risk management program for the cloud than anything else. Even though it has a lot of good structure to it, and I'll walk you through some of the templates and give you an idea of how it works. But basically, again, that's what it's sort of all about, is it's managing risk. So how do we deploy cloud services in the federal government so that we are not compromised by someone on the outside, right? And there's no question that demand for cloud professionals with experience has never been higher. If you go to LinkedIn, you'll see literally 2,000 jobs with FedRAMP as a nice to have, as a requirement, for example. So how is this FedRAMP program really managed? Well, there's going to be governing bodies that participate. Now, not every agency is a governing body, but typically the larger ones. And the governing bodies, of course, perform different tasks. They provide oversight. They go through the authorization, certification process, making sure that, for example, if a cloud provider like AWS, when they get a new service online, that it meets the requirements of FedRAMP. In other words, it meets the risk requirements. So that is a really big deal. Question. Yes, we will. I'll have the moderator provide some insight into that before we close. But yes, I don't think it'll be a problem to get a copy of the webinar and slide deck. Yes, good question. Thank you. So basically, again, FedRAMP is important for many different reasons. Now, in reality, to talk about FedRAMP is about an 8-hour class. And actually, some companies have a 2-day class. But I'm going to just cover the main points and make sure that that we have an idea. And then what I'd like to do is compare it to FISMA, because there's another acronym that's commonly used called FISMA, and that is legislation. So basically, again, we want to know the difference. But basically, let's talk about FedRAMP briefly, and then get into some comparisons. And then we'll proceed on and talk about opportunities, how you become basically FedRAMP enabled and all that. So FedRAMP is really important for any government contractor or any government employee to really understand. Also, it's really important for anyone trying to sell cloud services or integrate cloud services for the federal government. So let me give you some examples. If you're Microsoft and you want the government customers to use Azure, well, you need to have the compliance requirements sort of ready to go. You need to be authorized to have government customers on your cloud service. if you're Salesforce, if you're Palo Alto, IBM, so on and so on, AWS, right? All of these integrators, all of these cloud providers need to have people as well enabled in FedRAMP. And I'll give you some examples here when we get to that point in the slide deck. But a lot of people just don't realize the knowledge that that goes into FedRAMP, but also the demand for folks that even have a clue about it. All right, so this is going to provide basically increased consistency around solutions for cloud. They're going to also meet requirements around FISMA, and I'll talk about what that is here shortly. And transparency between the government and the provider. Automation around monitoring, and also assessments around secure cloud solutions. Now, when, let me get my pen here. Now, one of the things to be aware of is that FedRAMP is a result of basically the cloud first policy. And this came out through the Office of Management and Budget, and they realized we had to solve a problem. We didn't want the IRS, and we didn't want DHS and the Secret Service and, you know, the intelligence agencies or DoD to all be like having redundant duties and tasks to manage cloud. So the best way to address it was through what's called the cloud first policy. Now, this is a result of the Office of Management Budget basically saying, you know what, we need to mandate security requirements. We want to reduce this overlapping spending and fragmentation. So that's what FedRAMP is. Now, also, there was FISMA that came out, and this is a federal law that defined that government agencies needed to manage security. And that was the basis for FedRAMP. Now, NIST, again, I didn't talk about NIST too much, but the National Institute of Science and Technology out of Gaithersburg, Maryland, their Department of Commerce, basically, they manage all the best practices. They put together the templates basically around this. So these templates basically go through what we have to do to be compliant and how to assess it. So if you're a cloud provider, whether you're a SaaS or infrastructure as a service, and you want to sell to the government, you need to go through getting authorization to do that. So if you have a cloud service, again, we need to do what? We have to go and actually go through the authorization process, and I'll talk briefly about that. So basically, again, there's an authorization board you have to go through. You have an authorization, basically, authority you have to go through called an ATO. Basically, it's an approval process is really what it is. Now, there's controls as part of this. Now, for example, if you go and you look at NIST 800-53, this is basically what's defining most of the controls in FedRAMP. Now, it creates basically what's a baseline. So a baseline is what? A starting point that we need to use to make sure that we have set ACLs properly, that we have gone out and used the principle of least privilege, that we have gone out and secured ports that aren't open. There's a whole laundry list of stuff. So to get ready for this, we have to, if we're a service provider and integrator, we have to pay basically a third party to come in and go through basically these checklists to do an assessment. All right, so what is FedRAMP and what is FISMA? Now, we want to simply think of FISMA as a federal law. It's a standard that's been set, signed by, the government, by the executive branch. And basically, I think it was Obama in his first term signed it. And basically, again, it's a law that mandated federal government agencies to get basically enabled in security. Whereas FedRAMP is more of a cloud risk assessment or risk management approach that is built off of FISMA. So that's sort of where that comes in. People confuse FISMA and FedRAMP as the same thing. FISMA is a law, executive order, or basically congressional order signed by the president, I should say. So it's a law. FedRAMP is a directive by the Office of Management and Budget to have everybody doing the same thing in the federal government when it comes to what? To cloud. So that's really the high level difference. So I just want to make sure we got that, because these terms get thrown out there and people get confused for good reason. All right, so FISMA is a law in 2002 that was enacted to strengthen the security of the government. FISMA applies to all information systems in general, but FedRAMP applies to what? To cloud service providers and also agencies that do plan to use cloud. So think of FedRAMP as a result of the cloud first policy that uses FISMA for cloud. Okay, and it was developed as a program for cloud service providers to get an assessment conducted by a 3PAO. That is a third-party audit office, basically. All right, so how do we get authorization? So let's say you're an integrator, you want to do work for the government. You have to get certain requirements met to meet compliance. The first thing is that the service provider will be granted authority to operate. There's generally what's called a provisional. So that's a temporary authority to operate, meaning that you could start soliciting, responding to RFPs, etc. So that's what that's about. Let me check the chat here. Okay, good question. Is FISMA a law for all information systems in the federal space, or a law? Yes, that is correct. FISMA applies to basically all the federal government agencies. Now, there's always sort of exceptions to a degree, like the intelligence agencies sort of do what they want. But generally, in general, FISMA applies to civilian and military organizations. So it is a law. Very good. Yes, correct. All right, so that's the first step. The second step is that the service provider needs to meet with the FedRAMP security control requirements that are in NIST. Basically, you have to meet them, meaning that, you know, they're going to, accommodate them is another way to look at it. The next thing that happens is that there's security packages that will require templates, and I'll show you where you find those. The CSP is going to need to come in and pay for a third-party assessor. The next thing that would happen is that there's a package that will be posted in the FedRAMP security secure repository. Let me get some water. Sorry about that. So when it comes to compliance, it comes down to two methods. There's a JAB board where you, as the service provider, you would go through the JAB. Basically, I'm going to request my cloud service be approved for all the agencies I can get, basically, and then the board will give you some kind of provisional authority if there's a reason to, or if you don't get approved, then you have to fix what has to be fixed. Or what can happen is that the agency says, you know what, we don't have time to go through a JAB. We really need this cloud service, and we're going to go sponsor it, and we'll handle this ourselves. So those are the two methods that compliance requirements can be met. And then there's different impact levels. So basically, impact levels are security levels. Basically, like in the world of government contracting, we would have top secret, secret, classified, unclassified, and other different security classifications. this is similar based on the amount of controls that you probably need to validate and also need to comply with. So this is not so much per se, you know, is this secret or not? It's more focused on what are the level of controls we have to go through to deal with. Now, here's an example of EWS public security contract vehicles. For example, they're on a lot of federal contracts. Now, in the world of government contracting, we would call a contract vehicle typically by an acronym. And you can see here, there's a lot of acronyms. So you have JEDI, you have SOUP, NASA SOUP, you have COMET. Basically, these are just acronyms that define what the contract's about. So, you know, again, it could be Army ITIS, which is like Information Technology Enterprise Services, NetSense, Network, Central, Tactical, whatever. I forgot exactly what it stands for. But basically, each of these vehicles, or either like for NASA, this is just for NASA generally. So this is special just for NASA. JEDI is Department of Defense, where GSA is typically open to all government agencies. So that's typically what you might see. And then Army is typically an Army-based contract. And then what about, so if there's any questions, please let me know. So let's talk about opportunities to be a cloud expert in the federal government sector. Now, as I have previously mentioned, I sold tens of millions of dollars worth of services, cloud solutions, managed services to many different agencies in and outside of the Beltway. So whether it was the Veterans Affairs or Secret Service or IRS or DHS or any number of other smaller agencies that I can think of, I may have, you know, had some experience with them. And every agency, I can tell you, sort of looks at things differently. Some agencies, such as DHS and, for example, the intelligence agencies, are very technology focused. Whereas some other agencies, for example, are less technology focused. For example, like the Department of Agriculture, Department of Education. Those agencies are somewhat more archaic. They look at things differently. They also don't have the budgets that the other agencies would have. So again, it's about understanding the agency as well. Now, what are some jobs that typically would require FedRAMP knowledge? Now, it could be anything from solutions architects to pre-sales architects to cloud architects, enterprise architects, security architects, just some. And then, you know, as far as like what kind of certifications that you probably want. Now, remember, FedRAMP is what? It's really more focused around risk management, security, and compliance. So the CISSP is a cert that would definitely be very helpful. The CRISC, the risk, the risk certification would be, very helpful. Also to the CISM, ISA, and the CAS from CompTIA. Those are all very valid certs that would help you. Excuse me. So when we go to LinkedIn, there's over 2,000 roles. Now, what I like to do is take a second and just talk about a few, just to give you an idea of maybe what you need to look for and how you need to look for it. Because again, like I said, every company, every agency is going to look at life differently. So, that's weird. There it is. So if we go to FedRAMP, and I just do a US search, there's actually 1,800. That's funny, that dropped like from 2 days ago from 2,000. Wow, that's really funny. That's quite a drop. That's like a 5% drop almost. Okay. But anyway, so you could see that FedRAMP when we search for that. And can we see that okay, I think you should. Yeah, it looks like it could. So let's just take one of these. Let's look at, this one's in Boston with RSA. Again, I'm not recommending any of these. I'm not saying they're good or bad. I'm just giving you an example of how companies look for FedRAMP knowledge and how you could apply for these roles, whether or not you have a security clearance. Okay, so this is a senior compliance advisor. Let's look at this one, a cloud architect. So this one here is for a company, it's based out of Arlington. I'm guessing if it's in Roslyn, it's probably going to be one of the DoD customers. They don't typically tell you who it may be or who they are sometimes, but probably. So if we go down here, let me expand my, okay. So over here, this is ActionNet out of Arlington. They're going to be asking you to work basically for a federal client in Roslyn. They want you to be a cloud architect and you need FedRAMP. Now this role is going to look for basically cloud experience. So if you have cloud experience, that's a really good start. You scroll down here, they want what cert? A CISSP. They want you to understand FedRAMP and the government's authority to operate, right? Odd, right? We just talked about ATO and authority and being able to get compliance done. So that's just one example. How are we doing on time? Okay, we got time for one or two more just to give you sort of a different view. So this one here, FedRAMP, for example, is more of a preferred skill. Now, if we go over here to, let's see here, Google. So Google Cloud Architect. Now, this is healthcare, and this is out of Irvine, California. They do support remote locations, unless if you're in Jacksonville, Florida. So just laughing. Okay, so you see here, experience. So now some roles look at, do you have experience other than just knowledge, right? So Google is looking for you to understand FedRAMP, cybersecurity as well. And again, so this case here, you'll be working probably with commercial and government customers, it would appear. And then this one here is actually a FedRAMP project manager. So for example, this is for the USG, basically for this agency. So basically, as far as this agency is concerned, this is a PMP role that you'll need to walk through the agency and the partners through the FedRAMP certification. So you'll need to put together the compliance packages. You'll need to put together and basically go through interviews and work with stakeholders basically to go through basically a provisional authority to operate to an ATO, to running audits, to getting the auditors in, stuff like that. That's probably what the role is going to look for. So again, also too, remember we talked about FISMA, right? That's the Federal Information Security Modernization Act. Well, guess what? They want you to know FISMA and FedRAMP, which makes sense. You're going to know this. Also, what do you need to know? You need to have NIST background as well. So that means what you probably want experience with is, for example, let's go to AWS FedRAMP and look at some of the services. Now, with FedRAMP compliance, with AWS, for example, they support FedRAMP probably the best of any cloud provider. So they have an FAQ here. You go through what customers are using AWS, a whole laundry list, for example. So you go here to find out more about AWS and how they support it. And if we scroll down here, now FedRAMP, one thing to point out is FedRAMP services are only covered in specific regions. So for example, US West or US East, for example. They're not supported, of course, like in Europe or Asia or every US region. So you go down here and find out more. So what about FedRAMP security authorizations? So they walk you through, again, some things to think about. Now, if we go over here and we want guidance on trusted internet connections, again, AWS has the best documentation. They'll walk you through everything on how you connect your on-prem services to the FedRAMP cloud services, for example. So a hybrid cloud is the way to look at it. Now, if we go over here, we could see, actually, let me go over here, compliance. Now, when it comes to compliance, it's not just about FedRAMP, right? We know that FedRAMP is important for cloud, but AWS supports a lot of other federal-based compliance requirements, like FISMA. But if I go to FedRAMP here, it brings me back here. And then if I go here, these are the requirements, tells you about the different types, everything here. So here we go to AWS services that are in scope by compliance program. So if I go here to FedRAMP, this will tell me that these services with the check mark are basically in scope of FedRAMP, but it'll also tell me that AppStream 2.0 is under review. In other words, it's not approved yet for basically East and West moderate. It is approved for high GovCloud. Now, these are different levels, and remember with FedRAMP, we have high, low, medium, or actually high, moderate, low, and then SaaS as well. So there's really 4 levels. So they support 2. So AWS doesn't really support software as a service. So that would be like Salesforce. Now, there are definitely jobs. I have a question here. Do the job opportunities require TS clearances? Some do, not all though. So that's a really good question. And I'm going to talk about clearances in a few minutes. So I'm going to get to that here shortly. So you can see here, some of these like Kubernetes, EKS service, again, approved in one, not the other. So you go ahead and just take a look at that and just understand how you could validate that. And then they have, of course, the other compliance requirements like PCI, SOX, etc. All right, so let's go back over here. Now, how do you become an expert in the federal government sector? Now, to get a clearance is going to be very helpful. Now, some agencies, some contractors will sponsor a clearance. Now, to get a secret clearance, for example, will take sometimes 6 months to 1 year to get the background checks done. To get a top secret is typically at least 18 months. And it does depend on the clearance level and the agency. Now, prior military is helpful. Most folks in technology that get out of the military already have a clearance. I was one of those. So when it comes to being a government employee, you get a clearance that way, or work for a government contractor like Lockheed Martin. They'll sponsor the right people. Booz Allen Hamilton, you name it, right? Most of them have roles you can work and you'll be sponsored. Now, not every agency will let you work if you don't have a clearance. So that's where the kicker comes in, right? It's all a depends sort of scenario. Now, when it comes to resources, there's, of course, FedRAMP.gov. There's AWS compliance resources, and then there's FedRAMP assessors as well. And let me show you that over here. Now, what you could do, let's say, for example, you like to do audits, you like to perform basically compliance reports. That's something you could do for specific organizations that have that ability to do that. So if you want to become a third-party assessor, you could do that as well. So to become an accredited assessor, there's a whole process to do it. It'll take about a year to get through this process as well. Again, just review this. You have to get pre-authorized. There's a report you want to read. And then, over here, first you need to go here to the A2LA website. This will tell you the requirements. So to be a compliance auditor, generally you need some experience around other compliance requirements. ISO is typically the baseline that they use. So you would apply here. If you got approved, if you met the requirements, you would get access to training, and then you would, be put in the pool to go through the evaluation process. So again, that's one route as well that people can consider. And one more thing to point out as well is some of the jobs do require clearances. So the question is a great question. So if I type in clearance, about only 170 actually put clearance as a requirement. So this is a great way to get into, excuse me, to get into the federal sector without a clearance, and start talking about cloud, and then get through sort of like the integrator process, and then get your clearance that way. It's not an overnight process though, as I had stated. So Kearney and Company, compliance engineer, solutions architect, VMware, clearance jobs, solutions architect. Let's see, consulting, solutions engineer. Okay, so this one here is at Quantico, for example, enterprise cloud architect. So to work on Quantico, they of course want you to know FedRAMP, DISA is nice to have, DoD RMF, so that's risk management. And then down here, you'll see somewhere clearance, and the salary range is good. It's up to $200,000 with benefits. So that's not a bad deal, especially if you could work down Quantico, which is south of DC, which the cost of living would be a little bit lower too. So that could be a good deal. And then again, you see here, where is it? Somewhere here they say clearance, you just gotta find it, clearable. So, okay, so this one here, so they want you to have a secret clearance to start, but you have to be clearable to a TS-SCI. Now, that's a compartmental investigation. This is, again, typically going to require a polygraph. So there is a price to pay for that salary generally. Okay, and I'll do one more before we go to close out and questions. Let's see, this one's with AWS, Richmond, Virginia. Again, do you want to work for, now this one here is working on RFPs. This is like pre-sales, working with customers in the government sector to help enable the customer get to FedRAMP. Again, what are they looking for? Same thing over and over, right? Nothing there that's particularly difficult. This is like basically understanding a document is what they're looking at. Now, you want experience working for consulting companies, sales companies, right? Having here a security clearance is a plus. Now, AWS can sponsor a clearance. So this is, again, a good start for you. So basically, if they could tie you to an agency, they can, sponsor you to get your investigation. So anyways, so as you see, there's a lot of opportunities just in the federal government, even without a clearance. Now, are a lot of the jobs in DC area? Absolutely. Are there jobs outside of DC? As you see, absolutely. It all depends. So just take a look, start applying. LinkedIn does a really good job, for example, and if you go over here, let's see this one here, Cloud Infrastructure Manager. You can see that they had 8 applicants, right? And it's only 22 hours ago, so that's Boston. Let's go up here though, and I'm just trying to, again, don't get discouraged if you don't have this experience. Let's go over here to Fairfax. Okay, this job here had 68 applicants, wow. So as you see, there is a lot of competition, but in 2 weeks, that's not too bad actually. Over here with Google, 17 applicants in 2 days. That's not too bad, you know. Again, it all depends, you know. This one here, 4 applicants in 3 months. So, you know, it's all about the requirements, what they're looking for. So take a look. You know, again, they're looking for FedRAMP, DoD, FISMA, right? They want you to know AWS and Google and VMware, but nothing here that looks totally out of the ordinary. Okay. All right. So let's go ahead and close out the presentation. If there's any questions, feel free to speak up. So what I'd like you to be aware of again, if you're looking for any kind of cloud or security training, compliance, Quick Start, you know, course has options. Train your team, get yourself enabled to get that better job or to relocate your family or whatever you may be looking for. So when it comes to demand for cloud skills, again, there's a lot of demand in the government sectors. Don't be shy if you don't have that experience. However, get an understanding of FedRAMP. Know what it is, be able to talk intelligently. Know some of the acronyms. Put those acronyms after you learn them, right, on your resume, on your LinkedIn profile. Trust me, when you could get a match from 60% to 80 or 90%, and the recruiter sees that you matched 90% of, you know, the keywords, then that's better than 60. And all you had to do was add, you know, FedRAMP or FISMA or compliance, right? Those are things that people forget to do. Update your keywords, update your resume.